Alright, welcome back to Klein & Class as provided by the Lemoyne Center. We're going to be talking about your constitutional rights today. Let's get started. Now, as you're probably following my English class, you know just how much I love context. So, let's do a little bit of a review. I know that the 7 Years' War one was probably very confusing for you guys. So, all I meant to illustrate by the 7 Years' War is that so much of what was going on in the world around them took America kind of by storm and by force. They didn't really have all the necessary elements of governing themselves, and realistically nobody did. Even over in Europe, where they actually were making the decisions, all their decisions had less to do with their people and more to do with the enemies of their enemies' friends' enemies. And it just became this incredibly large web that no one could really control. Your constitutional rights. So, as you know, we had the Whiskey Rebellion. America stood up, said, you know what? No more of this stuff where we take orders from over shore, no more of this taxation with no representation. We're going to run our own business. What's that look like, though? Now, I'm not trying to take a side here between two different interpretations of the Constitution. Traditionally, if you actually look back at the beginning of American history, it goes one of two ways. And by the way, no matter what someone's political stance, they always still go to one of these two when it comes to the Constitution. Way number one. Unless it says it in there, that ain't a rule. So, unless it explicitly spells it out in a way that is totally direct, the Constitution doesn't say that. Now, it doesn't matter which side of the argument you're going to be on. I mean, look at the Second Amendment. People have torn that thing apart and patched it back together and argued back and forth on it for a long, long time about how it's supposed to be interpreted. But, this is the important thing, if you go with the "it doesn't say that," whichever side of that argument you're going to be on, you're going to use that criteria. It doesn't say that I have to ... Or it doesn't say I do have to ... It's just, unless it says it explicitly. The second is, it's implied. So, going back to the Second Amendment. It is implied within the Second Amendment, when it says the government shall not infringe, that any infringement is wrong. Well, it doesn't explicitly state that, but it's implied when it says shall not be infringed. So, that is what I'm talking about, the two basic ways. Now, certain elements are going to come up again. We talked about taxes, and you're going to see that, especially 7 through 8 here. It says speedy trial, trial by jury. Also, it says something in there about $20, but that doesn't really apply anymore, because who doesn't have $20 lying around somewhere? And that you can't set an outrageous bail. Here was the point of all of that. Remember how, you know, when the English wanted to start collecting their taxes, they said, okay, in order to collect our stamp tax, you have to come all the way over to England in order to pay it off. And the Americans were like, well, who's got time to take 2 months out of their schedule, sail to Britain, go into a trial held by a judge that I didn't elect, that has no reason to listen to me, only to be sent all the way back here to be fined. I lose 2 months of business. I lose all that time I'm there arguing my case in front of someone who doesn't even care and will not be affected by ruling against me. So, we got rid of that. Then they ran into that same problem with the Whiskey Rebellion. Alright, well, why should I spend 2 months trekking over the mountains and going to Philadelphia and arguing in Pittsburgh about, I mean, obviously they were also going through Pittsburgh, that was another issue, about whether or not, you know, this is a just tax or whether I'm going to pay it and you guys are tyrants, all that. It's the same problem, just in a different scale. Alright? So, that's what a lot of this is. They wanted to make sure that anyone who had legal problems could deal with those very legal problems. Next. Alright, I'm going to take a second here, I'm going to get a drink. Next, we're also going to take a look at the basic rights as they're explicitly told, and the implied rights that you're going to see as they bear out. Number 1, all rights, and this is very important to grasp whenever we're discussing the right and the wrong here. All rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they're all self-evident. They even go so far as to say created by God, but what that implies isn't really about, that's not really a religious statement, that's sort of a formal statement about the government. Because if the government creates your rights, then your rights come from the government. To clarify, the self-evident God-created stuff. Let's say you're walking through a forest. There's no one else around. What do you have the right to do? Well, life, right? Liberty, you can go wherever you want, and to do whatever you want. It's self-evident. If there's no one else around to stop you, that's what you're going to do, and that's what's going to happen. Okay, so these three things sort of follow out, and you'll see that, especially when it comes to, like, think about the trial by jury one. If you're walking alone in the forest, you can't be put on trial by jury, right? You can't be put on any trial, as a matter of fact. The second half of this that comes in conflict with the former is health and safety. This has lately become an issue when people are talking about the COVID scare and about the right to bear arms and free speech and the trial by jury and bail and basically all of them. These inherent self-evident rights come into conflict with health and safety. Okay, I can say whatever I want, right? If I was in the middle of the forest and I start screaming at the top of my lungs, there's no danger there. I could scream, "Fire aloud!" No harm, no foul. But if you're in a movie theater and you scream fire, that can start a stampede and that can injure other people. That affects health and safety of the public. That's the government's job. So you do have the right to say whatever you want. You do not have the right to say whatever you want if it endangers someone else's health and safety. Here's a good rule of thumb whenever I'm discussing it. America guarantees freedom of conscience, not freedom from consequence. You can believe, and by the way, this is one more self-evident, people believe things. Religiously they believe things in their First Amendment. People gather together. It's self-evident that they do this stuff, right? I mean, no matter where you go in the world, people gather together. That might as well be labeled a right. It is self-evident, and you can believe whatever you want about people who gather together or people who don't gather together. What you don't get is the freedom from the consequences of that. If you gather together and you, I don't know, break into a store and steal stuff, yes, you have the right to assembly, but, so the police can't just disperse you for that, but when it affects health and safety, or there are negative consequences to your actions, you say something wrong and you're held accountable for it, that you have the right to keep the government from keeping you from saying it, but not to protect you after you say it, if that makes sense. So, simply put, you can say whatever you want, but you gotta watch what you say. Next. Let's go through them one by one, that way I know you've got them all in your head. Tell me which one you find interesting in the comments below, and then you can sort of just give me your reason for why you find it interesting. Interesting, right. Number one, freedom of religion. Now, there is a bit here that the government had to step forward to say, you're free to exercise this religion, and not the other way around. Think about this critically for a moment. Let's say you see someone praying. Okay. Now, in the old world, Europe, certain parts of the Middle East, there was a lot of religious tension. But that religious tension was only underscored by the fact that it was cultural religion. Do you call the head of your particular temple a priest or a minister? Is it a pastor? Who decides this stuff, right? These are sort of odd elements to us today because we usually don't care. But it mattered because if it was a priest, priests report to guy number A, and guy number A is friends or political allies with these individual countries. And therefore, what you're telling me is that the religion you practice makes you beholden to these other nations of whom I'm an enemy. It's really a more religious thing than it really is like a concept thing. So, it's sort of self-evident that you can't control what someone else believes about the spiritual realm. All right, do you believe in heaven? Do you believe in hell? Is it possible to not believe in heaven or in hell? I don't know. These are all the workings of the mind. You can't really force someone else to like pray to the right God or pray to the wrong God either. Like, oh, you're praying to Satan. Well, how would you know? Like, you and Satan talk about my prayers? I don't know. So there's a lot of, like, in terms of thought process, you can't actually dictate to someone else who they pray to. The U.S. took it a little bit of a step further here and said, the government shouldn't be interfering on this. Okay, if someone goes to a priest and says, priest, pray for me, or if someone goes to a pastor and says, pastor, pray for me, what's the difference? There's a difference, certainly, but it's not the government's job to dictate that. Let people worship how they want. Next is assembly. Once more, it's self-evident that people assemble together. The government shouldn't be stopping people from getting together unless it affects health and safety. Once more, you can assemble with each other, but once you start doing stuff that's illegal, then they can arrest you. They shouldn't be arresting you for simply assembling together, but that goes by a case-by-case basis, and I'm not going to get into all that. 3, speech, obviously. Once more, it's self-evident, and by the way, these are universal rights. Even if you weren't told you have the right to free speech, you still can say whatever you want. No one can actually, unless they put their hand over your mouth and say, don't you talk, it couldn't stop you from saying stuff. That doesn't mean that you're free from the consequences of what you say. It just means that you can say whatever you want, and the government shouldn't be interfering in that. It also says here petition, so sometimes people sit down and say, well, I want to change the definition of property lines. Why not? Alright. That was once more a nod back to how America tried to stay in good contact with Britain, and they started petitioning the government, and the government didn't like that, because it was basically telling them the business. And so they said, from this point forward, not only is it self-evident that people want to communicate with the government, but governments don't have the business to tell their citizenry, don't tell us how to run our job. Your job is to do what the citizenry wants you to do. So yeah, take the petitions. And it's also a very important part of our constitutional republic. By the way, this is my mandatory talk about how America is a constitutional republic, not a democracy. Alright, there's a difference. Constitutional republics, we elect leadership, and we have a written constitution for rules as to how we respect individual rights. Democracy is just ruled by the people. I know that gets a little, sometimes you'll see people bounce on that back and forth. Yeah, democracy, we are ruled by the people, but we have written rules that you really can't violate. And we elect representatives to write our laws, we don't write them ourselves. Except for the petition thing, oddly enough. Number 2, arms. I'll be very gentle on this because I know a lot of people have very strong opinions, but here's the way to view it from the self-evident angle. Arms are tools. I have a knife. Not on me, don't worry. But I've used knives in the past to chop up my food. Okay. Human beings use tools. Self-evident. Once more, if you're walking through the woods, can you make a tool? Yes, of course you can. Should the government dictate to other people what tools they can or cannot use? That's where the health and safety argument comes in. Some people say, well, it's safer if I have it, or it's safer if my neighbor has it, or it's more dangerous if only the government has these tools at their disposal. I'm not taking a side, I'm just saying that's how it's sort of self-evident that people make arms. I mean, you can pick up a twig and turn it into a weapon, or a pan, hammers. This is what people do. They make tools, so it's self-evident that people make these tools, and it also says a symbol of militia, and people want to fight about that, so I'm not going to bring it up. Number 3. All it says up here, because I know you can't read it, is 1/4. It is quartering. This is a weird one, but you have to bear in mind at the time it was very important. During the Revolutionary War, British soldiers were quartering, that is to say, living with American families. So they'd show up, they would tell them, we have guns, and you have to feed us, clothe us, and house us. And so the American people wanted protection against that stuff happening anymore. the vast majority of the time, people just skip number 3 because it has nothing to do with anything that goes on until this year, where a hotel manager actually threw out members of the National Guard and said, I have the right to do so because they're soldiers and I don't have to put up anybody. Legally, I'd say he has the right. You don't really have to take care of government agents, but it's an awkward conversation. But it's in there, is all my only point on that. Determine, and by the way, when I say tell me what you find interesting about it, just, you don't have to fight about the correct interpretation. Just say, here's what I think is interesting, put it down there, maybe we'll talk about it civilly. 4, search and seizure. Without a warrant, the government is not supposed to be able to look through our things. Now, people will argue about that. Okay, so let's say I'm walking, once more, if you're walking through a forest, no one's going to stop you and pat you down, right? Well, what about health and safety? What if I'm patting down a guy and he's got a firearm on him? Well, doesn't he have the right to have tools? Yeah, but if he has a firearm on him and he's walking down a street where other people are around, that affects their health and safety, and therefore I can pat them down. The right to bear arms is also interfering with his health and safety. So that's where some of these rules come in, and then people, let me rephrase on why I say people. Then people will argue about whether or not it actually affects health and safety. Okay, well, if he's not hurting anybody, should you stop and frisk? Well, I mean, and then they go back and forth. Is it safer to stop him? If he's a bad guy and he's got a gun, isn't it more dangerous to stop him? Okay, if it's a good guy and he's got a firearm, doesn't he have a right to bear arms? And so they'll go back and forth on this. Mostly, it's supposed to keep, what was actually happening is that at the beginning of the war, the British tried to take arms away from the colonists. That way they couldn't actually defend themselves or their territory. That didn't work. Once more, people defend themselves. Once more, people make tools. And once more, nobody wants to be stopped and hassled by officers of a court or officers of, especially a court that's not beholden to me. So, this is one of the things they threw in there to say, well, we don't want anybody messing with us. Number 5 is compelled speech. If you have ever heard someone say, I plead the 5th, that means you can't make me tell you I broke the law. Here's the background on it that actually formed this actual situation. Compelled speech was, okay, so money goes missing. Unfortunately, back in the old world, that is to say Europe, they would round up who they thought did it and they would just beat them until they confessed. So that doesn't go well. This happened a little while ago with, up in New York, the Central Park 5, if you heard about this. They rounded up like 5 teenagers and they just hammered away at these kids. What did you do? What was you doing? And it's like, okay, so, a bunch of police officers pushed these kids into admitting to a crime that they actually didn't end up committing. And then the whole thing just fell out from there. Well, what if they were committing another crime? Well, the police officers were just trying to do their job. They're not. The government isn't supposed to be doing that. You're never really supposed to make someone say that. How broadly does this go? Okay, so think about this for a second. If I told you the government can't make you say something, that actually makes sense, right? Once more, you're walking through the woods. It's sort of the other half of free speech if you think about it. If I'm free to say whatever I want, I should also be free to not say things I don't want. What if the government tells you that you have to swear an oath? So you're in school and they say pledge allegiance to the flag and you don't. Can the school, a government agency, force you to? Does it actually affect health and safety? Okay, so you say, I'm not going to swear allegiance to the flag. And that starts a fight, a literal physical fight. Well, that's health and safety. On the other hand, if it's self-evident they can't compel you to speech, then shouldn't it be evident that they can't let other people hurt you? It's the other people who are affecting your health and safety. It makes a lot of sense that this is in the Constitution, but people will argue about what is defined as compelled speech. How do you define, I have to say this, or else? Mostly I would say the danger here is the government, the federal government, is not supposed to be forcing people to say things because it comes across as disingenuous. I mean, imagine if, like, Congress rounded up a bunch of random people, put them in front of a television camera and said, you have to swear allegiance. You have to tell people that you love America and that we're doing a great job. Not only would it not make their argument seem very good, that they're doing a good job, but also it seems like then the opposite would then be true. If you have to force people to say that you're doing a good job, then clearly you're not doing a good enough job that they do it on their own. So, compelled speech makes a lot of sense, and it is important. I'm running out of time, so there's one more I want to draw your attention to. States' rights. So 9 and 10, 9 says that you basically have a whole bunch of rights that no one can really, there's not enough time to go through them all. I mean, think about it. Do you have the right to breathe? Do you have the right to grow out your facial hair? Do you have the right to dress however you want? Once more, if you're alone in the forest, then you can do whatever you want. It's only when you're affecting other people that these rights are supposed to be, questioned. Now, states' rights is an awkward conversation that people have. Can the mayor of the city tell a federal agency you're not to come here? So, let me put it like this. Let's say Governor Wolf calls up Washington, D.C., and he says, this year, none of our citizens here in the great state of Pennsylvania are paying their federal income tax. Well, he's not supposed to be able to do that. What it says is, here's technical criteria. You cannot pass a law in your state that violates any of these. You can't say, like, you don't have free speech out in California. That's against the law. You can't do that. It goes under First Amendment, and therefore you're not allowed to pass it, and therefore it gets struck down as unconstitutional. When it comes to states' rights, what it says is, with the exception of their constitutional rights, that you can't interfere with, any other thing that you can imagine would be dictated by the states. Here's how that works. So, someone says, you have the right to free speech. The government of California cannot say you don't have the right to free speech. What they can do, however, is they can pass laws that determine what health and safety violations would look like. So, do you have the right to assembly? Sure. Do you have the right to assembly if you're calling for acts of violence? Well, that violates health and safety. Other things is that another statehood situation is property lines. You see property lines anywhere else? Any of this? No. So it's dictated by the state. The state says this is ours, this is yours, this is your neighbor's. These are all state issues. And frankly, this mostly came to a head during the Civil War because the argument became, can the federal government dictate things down that aren't in the Constitution? So, I mean, think about it like this. The Constitution did talk about slavery because of the whole, if you have slaves, then they don't really pay taxes or vote. So why would they be in the census? So why would you get more votes and more congressional representatives? And that hobbled the efficacy of slave states. They didn't have as much political power as they wanted. They wanted more because they actually had more people. On the other hand, those people weren't paying taxes, they weren't voting, and they weren't petitioning their government. Also, they didn't have the right to assemble, right? And then the other half of that became, well, if they're going to be full citizens, if they're going to be part of your voting system, then doesn't all this apply? That's why Lincoln talks about life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Okay? How do you have people in America who live here, work here, they don't have rights? How's that work? You know? Like, think about that for a second. I mean, there are people here, but this stuff doesn't apply to. I mean, if you have if you're considered mentally incompetent by the state, then no, this stuff doesn't apply to you. If you need, if you're a minor, if you're 12, you don't have the right to bear arms. On the other hand, states said it's self-evident that we can secede from the Union. And the Union said, I don't think that's self-evident at all. I think what's self-evident is that these people yearn to be free, and they're free here. And so they fought over it. Now, I would say, because people bicker back and forth about states' rights, it doesn't matter because the Confederates started shooting other people. And that's health and safety, and everybody wants to be healthy and safe. So, whether or not states literally have the right to secede, and both California and Texas love bringing this up like every election. Fun fact, the state of Texas has written into their constitution that whenever they want to, they can leave the Union. They're a lot of fun. And California a little while ago was floating a petition, using their First Amendment rights, to leave the Union after the 2016 election. So, doesn't matter whether you're on one side of the map or geography kind of doesn't matter in some cases. People have sort of similar opinions regardless of their culture, let's go with. But I think one of the important things to bear in mind with states' rights is it is in there, it is important, but it's not like people sort of pit states' rights against the feds. Like, oh, the federals shouldn't be doing this, and they're kind of right. But the Confederacy is not a good example of that because the Confederacy said, we're going to be our own our own nation, which is a federal entity, and they started shooting at people. So it's like, okay, you know, maybe you do have the right to tell the federal government that they can't take away your property, but once you start forming a militia and then going around shooting people, it's kind of like you started a war regardless. My point being, whether they're a foreign nation or whether they're just states in rebellion, however you want to classify it, around the time that the violence starts, that's when this stuff starts, you know? So it kind of doesn't matter whether or not they were exercising states' rights, at least from my perception. There will be people who say they didn't have states' rights on that because, and then they'll list reasons. But ultimately, it is important to say life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It's also important to take in public safety and health. Now, you know your prompt, post down below. Please be civil. I know that a lot of times people will argue about this stuff. If nothing else, just keep it real open-ended. My personal rule of thumb on morality is, or rather states' rights, the rights of people is that if I wouldn't want someone doing that to me, don't do it to me. I wouldn't do it to somebody else. You know, the golden rule. Obviously, a lot of really complex fights have come out of this, but it's important that you know your rights so that when you are an adult and you start exercising them, you know how to use them. You know, the police don't have the right to break into your house and search through your things. They don't. And when you see that stuff happening to other people, you should be defending those rights. All right. That's it for today. Have a good one, kids.